It was a busy Thursday evening in Atlanta when Marcus Johnson pulled his black Toyota Camry into the parking lot of the Southern Pearl restaurant. The autumn breeze gently rustled through the trees as he stepped out of his car, his simple blue hoodie and faded jeans a stark contrast to the elegant establishment before him. Marcus had spent the entire day visiting restaurant supply stores, checking prices for the new location he and his sister were planning to open. His normally neat appearance was now casual and slightly disheveled, with his hoodie bearing small stains from carrying boxes and checking inventory. But he didn't mind. After all, this was his restaurant too. The Southern Pearl stood proudly on the corner of Richmond Street, its elegant facade gleaming under the early evening lights. The restaurant's large windows revealed glimpses of crystal chandeliers and pristine white tablecloths inside. Well-dressed couples and business people walked through the heavy wooden doors, greeted by the soft sounds of jazz music and the gentle clink of fine china. Standing in the parking lot, Marcus smiled to himself. 3 years ago, this building had been nothing but an abandoned diner. Now, after countless sleepless nights, mountains of paperwork, and their entire life savings, he and his sister Sophia had transformed it into one of Atlanta's most prestigious restaurants. The Southern Pearl was their dream come true, a perfect blend of modern luxury and traditional Southern hospitality. As Marcus approached the entrance, he noticed several guests giving him questioning looks. He was used to it by now. Being a 32-year-old black restaurant owner in this upscale neighborhood often led to raised eyebrows and whispered comments. But Marcus had learned to let these things roll off his back. Success, he believed, was the best answer to prejudice. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with activity. The hostess station was empty for a moment, so Marcus quietly slipped past it. He wanted to observe how things ran when the staff didn't know the owner was present. This was something he did regularly, showing up unannounced, sitting in a corner, and watching the flow of service. Marcus chose a small booth in the corner, partially hidden by one of the restaurant's elegant room dividers. From here, you can see everything: the servers gracefully moving between tables, the bartender crafting colorful cocktails, and the steady stream of steaming plates leaving the kitchen. The aroma of fresh-baked cornbread and blackened catfish made his stomach growl. He noticed several new faces among the staff. The restaurant had been growing rapidly, and Sophia had mentioned hiring some new people. One of them was Karen Maxwell, the new floor manager, who stood near the bar with perfect posture in her crisp black suit. Marcus hadn't met her yet. She'd been hired just 2 weeks ago while he was away on a business trip to New Orleans. As he settled into his seat, Marcus pulled out his small notebook, the same one he'd been using all day to jot down supply prices. He started making notes about what he observed. The timing between courses at table 7 seemed a bit slow. The new bartender was making excellent connections with guests, and the recently updated lighting created the perfect ambience. A young server approached his table, her name tag reading Sarah. She was one of their newest hires, and Marcus could tell she didn't recognize him. Perfect. This would be a good test of their training program. "Good evening, sir," Sarah said with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Southern Pearl. May I start you off with something to drink?" Marcus ordered an iced tea, holding back his smile as Sarah efficiently took his order and hurried off. He was pleased to see the training standards being maintained with new staff. Everything seemed to be running smoothly, just as he and Sophia had worked so hard to achieve. But as Marcus sat there, making his observations and enjoying the atmosphere of his own creation, he didn't notice Karen Maxwell watching him from across the room. Her eyes narrowed as she studied his casual clothing and worn notebook. In her 2 weeks as manager, she had worked hard to maintain what she considered to be the restaurant's high standards, and in her mind, this man didn't fit them. Little did anyone know that the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would change the Southern Pearl forever. Karen Maxwell stood at the bar, her fingers drumming against its polished surface as she watched the man in the hoodie. In her 15 years of restaurant management, she had developed what she called a sixth sense for trouble, though others might have called it something else entirely. She watched as Sarah, the new server, brought him his iced tea. The man was writing something in his notebook, and this made Karen even more suspicious. In her mind, he could be a food critic trying to write a bad review, or worse, someone scoping out the restaurant for less honorable purposes. "Has anyone seen that man before?" Karen asked Tommy, the bartender who had been working at the Southern Pearl since it opened. Tommy glanced over while mixing a martini. "Oh, that's him. Tommy started to say, but Karen had already walked away, her heels clicking purposefully across the hardwood floor. She had made up her mind about what needed to be done. Marcus was in the middle of writing a note about the new wine list when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to find Karen standing there, her arms crossed and her face set in what she probably thought was a professional expression. "Sir, I need to speak with you," Karen said, her voice sharp enough to make nearby diners look up from their meals. "I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for quite some time, writing in that notebook." Marcus raised an eyebrow but kept his voice calm. "Yes, I'm making some observations. Is there a problem?" "Actually, there is," Karen replied, her voice getting louder. "This is a high-end establishment. We have certain standards here at the Southern Pearl. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The restaurant began to grow quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to watch. Marcus could see phones being pulled out, their cameras pointing in his direction. He had dealt with situations like this before, but never in his own restaurant. "Ma'am," Marcus said quietly, "I'm a paying customer. I ordered my drink, and I was about to order dinner. I don't understand what standards I'm not meeting." Karen leaned closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "Look at how you're dressed. Look around you. Everyone else here is in proper dinner attire. Your hoodie has stains on it, and you've been writing in that notebook. For all I know, you could be planning something inappropriate." Marcus took a deep breath, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in the face of prejudice. "I assure you, I have every right to be here." "No, sir, you don't," Karen said, her face reddening. "I'm the manager, and I get to make that call. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll be forced to call security." By now, the entire restaurant was watching. Sarah, the server, stood nervously nearby, looking like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Tommy, the bartender, was already reaching for his phone, likely calling Sophia in her office. "This is my final warning," Karen announced, pulling out her phone. "Leave now, or I'm calling security." Marcus remained seated, his hands folded calmly on the table. "Go ahead and make your call, but while you're at it, you might want to take a closer look at the photos on the wall behind you." Karen turned around, her eyes landing on the large photographs that lined the restaurant's walls. They showed the Southern Pearl's history, from its days as an abandoned building to its grand opening. And there, in the center photo, stood Marcus and Sophia Johnson, arms around each other, cutting the ribbon on opening day. Karen's face went pale as she slowly turned back to Marcus. But before she could speak, a voice rang out across the restaurant. "What in the world is going on out here?" Sophia Johnson stood in the doorway of her office, her dark skin flushed with anger as she surveyed the scene before her. Her brother sat calmly at the table while her new manager stood over him with a phone in her hand. "Marcus?" Sophia called out, walking quickly toward them. "I thought I heard your voice. Did you finish checking the restaurant suppliers today, brother?" The word brother seemed to echo through the silent restaurant. Karen's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered on the table. She looked as if someone had just thrown ice water in her face as the reality of her terrible mistake began to sink in. The silence in the Southern Pearl was deafening. Karen Maxwell stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as Sophia Johnson walked up to her brother's table. The other diners watched the scene unfold, many still holding their phones up to record everything. "I asked you a question, Karen," Sophia said, her voice calm but firm. "Why are you threatening to call security on my brother, who owns this restaurant with me?" Karen's face had turned from pale white to bright red. "Ms. Johnson, I had no idea. He didn't say. I mean, look at how he's dressed." Her words tumbled out in a desperate attempt to explain. Marcus stood up slowly, his notebook still in his hand. He was a tall man, and now Karen had to look up to meet his eyes. "You didn't ask who I was," he said quietly. "You just made assumptions. Isn't that right, Ms. Maxwell?" By now, some of the other customers had begun to talk among themselves. An older white couple near the window shook their heads in disapproval, not at Marcus, but at Karen. A group of young black professionals at another table were typing furiously on their phones, no doubt sharing the story on social media. "I want everyone to see what happened here tonight," said a woman who was still recording with her phone. "This is exactly what we deal with every day, even in 2024. Tommy, the bartender, had come out from behind the bar. I tried to tell you, Miss Maxwell, he said. I tried to tell you that was Mr. Johnson, but you walked away before I could finish. Sarah, the young server, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry. I should have said something when Ms. Maxwell started. Marcus raised his hand gently to stop her. Sarah, you did nothing wrong. You treated me exactly as you should treat any customer, with respect and good service. That's exactly what we train our staff to do. Sophia had pulled out her own phone and was reading something with a worried look on her face. Marcus, she said, it's already on Twitter, videos of the whole thing. People are sharing it like crazy. Indeed. Phones throughout the restaurant were buzzing as the incident went viral. Local news stations were already picking up the story. Restaurant manager tries to remove black owner from his own establishment. Karen seemed to shrink with each passing moment. Please, she whispered, I didn't mean. I was just trying to maintain standards. Standards? Sophia's voice was sharp. Our standards are about treating every single person who walks through that door with dignity and respect. Those are the standards our parents taught us, the standards we built this restaurant on. Marcus looked around the restaurant, at the shocked faces of the customers, at the embarrassed staff, at the trembling manager. He had worked too hard to let this moment be just another viral video of discrimination. This had to be something more. Everyone, he said, his voice carrying across the silent restaurant. I'd like your attention, please. All eyes turned to him. What happened here tonight is unfortunate, but it's also an opportunity. This is a teaching moment. He turned to Karen, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Miss Maxwell, you're going to learn from this. You're going to understand why what you did was wrong, not just for this restaurant, but for society. Sophia stepped forward. Starting tomorrow, we're going to make some changes around here. Big changes. Because the Southern Pearl isn't just about serving good food. It's about serving every person with dignity. The restaurant had begun to buzz with conversation again. Some customers were nodding in approval at Marcus's words. Others were still recording, but now they were capturing a different kind of moment. One of potential transformation rather than just confrontation. A local news van pulled up outside the restaurant's windows, its lights flashing in the growing darkness. The story was about to get bigger than just social media. Marcus looked at his sister, then at Karen, who was still standing there in shock. Ms. Maxwell, he said, we have a choice to make right now. We can either let this be just another viral video of discrimination, or we can turn it into something meaningful. Which would you prefer? The next few minutes would determine not just Karen's future, but the future of the Southern Pearl itself. The next morning, the Southern Pearl was closed for breakfast service, but inside, the restaurant was far from quiet. Marcus and Sophia sat at a large table with Karen Maxwell, while outside, news vans lined the street. The videos from last night had reached millions of views. Karen's hands shook as she held her coffee cup. She had spent the whole night reading comments online about herself. People were calling her terrible names, and some were even posting her personal information. She hadn't slept at all. I've lost everything, haven't I? Karen asked quietly, staring into her coffee. My career in restaurant management is over. No one will ever hire me again. Sophia looked at her brother. Marcus sat there thinking, his fingers tapping slowly on the table. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, making the crystal glasses on nearby tables sparkle. Tell me, Karen, Marcus said finally, why did you really think I didn't belong here? Karen began to give her usual answer about dress codes and standards, but Marcus held up his hand. The truth, please. We need honest answers if we're going to fix this. Tears started rolling down Karen's face. I guess I've always had certain ideas about how people should look in fancy restaurants. When I saw you in casual clothes, writing in that notebook, she paused, struggling with her words. I realize now I wasn't really worried about the clothes. I made assumptions because of your skin color, didn't I? Marcus nodded slowly. The first step is admitting it. Now, what do you think we should do about it? Just then, Tommy the bartender came in through the front door, followed by Sarah and several other staff members. They all stopped when they saw Karen sitting there. Come in, everyone, Sophia called out. We need the whole team here for this. The staff gathered around, some standing, others pulling up chairs. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Last night, Marcus began, addressing everyone. We had a terrible incident. But instead of just firing Ms. Maxwell and moving on, we're going to do something different. We're going to learn from this. He stood up and walked to the center of the room. The Southern Pearl was never just about serving fancy food. Our parents taught us that a true restaurant is about bringing people together, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they look or what they wear. Sophia joined her brother. Starting today, we're launching a new training program. Every staff member, from dishwashers to managers, will learn about unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and true hospitality. And, Marcus added, looking directly at Karen, Ms. Maxwell will be the first to go through this program. If she's willing to learn and change, she'll help us develop it for others. Karen's head snapped up in surprise. You're not firing me? No, Marcus said firmly. Running away from the problem doesn't solve it. But you'll be on probation. You'll work under Sophia's direct supervision, and you'll help us create training materials based on what happened here. The staff members looked at each other, some nodding in approval, others still uncertain. Sarah raised her hand nervously. Mr. Johnson, she said, could we also learn about how to speak up when we see something wrong? I feel so bad that I didn't say anything last night. Excellent suggestion, Sophia smiled. That will be part of the training too. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed everyone the latest news. Their story had gone national, with headlines reading, Restaurant owners turn racist incident into teaching moment. We're getting calls from other restaurants across the country, he explained. They want to know about our training program. This could be bigger than just the Southern Pearl. Karen stood up, wiping her eyes. I don't deserve this second chance, she said. But if you're willing to give it to me, I promise I'll work hard to change and help others change too. Marcus extended his hand to Karen. That's all we can ask for. Change starts with one person, one restaurant, one moment at a time. As they shook hands, camera flashes went off outside the windows. But this time, they weren't capturing a moment of shame. They were capturing a moment of transformation. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the Southern Pearl. The restaurant's private dining room had been temporarily converted into a training center, where Karen Maxwell stood in front of a group of restaurant staff from across Atlanta. I was wrong, Karen said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. I let my prejudices control my actions, and I nearly destroyed someone's dignity as well as my own career. But thanks to the Johnsons, I learned that change is possible if we're willing to face our mistakes. The room was packed with people. Marcus and Sophia sat in the back, watching as Karen shared her story. On the walls hung new photographs, not just of the restaurant's history, but of people from all walks of life enjoying meals together. Yesterday, Karen continued, a man came into the restaurant wearing work boots and construction clothes. 2 months ago, I might have treated him differently, but I remembered my training and greeted him just like any other guest. Turns out he owned 3 construction companies and booked our entire restaurant for his company's anniversary party. The crowd nodded, some taking notes. Among them were managers from other upscale restaurants in the city, all eager to learn from the Southern Pearl's new training program. Sarah, who had been promoted to head trainer, stood up next. The most important thing we've learned is that true hospitality doesn't look at clothes, skin color, or appearance. It looks at the human being walking through our door. Outside the training room, the Southern Pearl was busier than ever. People came not just for the excellent food, but because the restaurant had become a symbol of positive change. The viral video that could have ruined them had instead made them famous for all the right reasons. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. A major news network wanted to interview him and Karen together. They had been getting such requests almost daily, but this one was different. It was for a special program about businesses that were changing society for the better. Karen, Marcus called out after the training session ended. Can we talk for a minute? Karen walked over, looking much more confident than she had 2 weeks ago. Her black suit was the same, but she carried herself differently now. The shame in her eyes had been replaced by determination. The training program is working better than we expected, Sophia said, joining them. We've had requests from restaurants in 5 different states. They'd all want to know how we turned a potential disaster into something positive. Karen smiled slightly. I never thought I'd say this, but that night changed my life. Not just because you gave me a second chance, but because you made me face my own prejudices." Just then, Tommy the bartender rushed in with exciting news. "You won't believe this. The mayor's office just called. They want to give the Southern Pearl an award for promoting unity in the community." Marcus looked around the room at the staff gathering their things after the training session. Some were white, some were black, some were Asian, some were Hispanic. All of them were talking and laughing together, sharing stories and experiences. "You see that?" he said to Karen. "That's the real change. It's not about the awards or the news stories. It's about people learning to see each other as human beings first." Sophia checked her reservation list for the evening. "Tonight's going to be busy. We have people coming from 3 different states just to eat here. They say they want to support a restaurant that stands for something good." Karen straightened her jacket and picked up her training materials. "Should I share with them about the incident? About my mistake?" "Yes," Marcus said firmly, "because it's not just your story anymore. It's a story about how people can change, how businesses can do better, and how a bad moment can become a movement for good." As they walked out of the private dining room, they could hear the kitchen staff preparing for dinner service. The sounds of chopping, sizzling, and friendly chatter filled the air. The Southern Pearl was more than just a restaurant now. It had become a place of learning, understanding, and transformation. The hostess station had a new sign that read, "Welcome all who entered here." It was small, but it said everything about how the Southern Pearl had changed and how it hoped to change others. 1 month after the incident, the Southern Pearl was hosting its biggest event yet. The restaurant's elegant dining room had been transformed for a special evening called Breaking Bread, Breaking Barriers. People from all walks of life filled the tables, from business executives to construction workers, all dressed in whatever made them comfortable. Marcus stood at the front of the restaurant, wearing the same blue hoodie he had worn on that fateful night. This time, however, no one questioned his right to be there. Next to him, Karen Maxwell adjusted the microphone, preparing to give the most important speech of her life. "Good evening, everyone," Karen began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "1 month ago, I stood in this very spot and made the biggest mistake of my career. I judged a man based on his appearance and the color of his skin. That man turned out to be my boss, but more importantly, he turned out to be my greatest teacher." The room was silent as Karen continued her story. In the audience sat journalists from major newspapers, restaurant owners from across the country, and even a few celebrities who had heard about the Southern Pearl's transformation. "Thanks to the Johnsons," Karen said, "our training program has now reached 50 restaurants across the country. We call it Open Hearts, Open Doors, and it's changing how restaurants think about true hospitality." Sophia stood up next, joining Karen at the microphone. "We've served over 10,000 customers since that night," she announced. "And we've made one simple rule. Everyone is welcome here, exactly as they are." The crowd applauded as servers began bringing out special dishes created for the evening. Each plate told a story: soul food served on fine china, street food elevated to gourmet status, family recipes shared with pride. Tommy, now the head bartender, had created a special drink menu where each cocktail was named after a lesson learned. The most popular one was called "Don't Judge a Book," and it came with a small note about Marcus's story. Sarah, who had become the face of their staff training videos, walked around taking photos for the restaurant's new website. The homepage would feature real customers, not models, showing the true diversity of their clientele. "Look at this," Marcus said quietly to Karen, showing her his phone. Their story had inspired a movement. Restaurants across America were starting to remove strict dress codes. High-end places were training their staff to focus on service, not appearance. The hashtag Welcome Yezuer was trending nationwide. A young black businessman stood up to share his story. "Last year, I was turned away from an upscale restaurant because I was wearing sneakers after a long day at work. Today, I own 3 successful companies, and I choose to do all my business dinners at the Southern Pearl because they see people for who they are, not what they wear." Karen wiped away tears as she listened. She remembered how close she had come to making the same mistake. But instead of being remembered as the manager who discriminated, she was becoming known as the woman who helped change an industry. Near the end of the evening, Marcus clinked his glass for attention. "When our parents opened their first small diner 30 years ago," he said, "they taught us that food brings people together. They said a true restaurant feeds both the body and the soul. Tonight, we're not just serving dinner, we're serving hope. The mayor, who had come to present the Community Service Award, stood up next. The Southern Pearl has shown us that one moment of confrontation can lead to a lifetime of change. They didn't just handle a crisis, they created a movement. As the evening drew to a close, Karen found herself standing in the exact spot where she had confronted Marcus that night. But now, instead of prejudice in her heart, she felt purpose. Instead of fear of those who were different, she felt curiosity about their stories. Sometimes, she said to a young reporter who was interviewing her, our worst mistakes can lead to our greatest achievements, but only if we're brave enough to learn from them. Outside, the restaurant's sign glowed brightly in the evening sky. Below the name, the Southern Pearl, a new tagline had been added, where everyone's story matters. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of how change begins with one person, one moment, and one choice to do better. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night at the Southern Pearl. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Marcus Johnson stood in front of a crowd at the National Restaurant Association's annual conference in Chicago. Next to him stood Karen Maxwell, both of them now nationally recognized speakers on restaurant industry reform. 6 months ago, Marcus began, addressing the packed hall. A simple decision to visit my own restaurant in casual clothes led to something none of us expected. Today, we're here to announce something special. The crowd leaned forward in their seats. Restaurant owners, managers, and staff from across the country had gathered to hear about the program that had started with one uncomfortable incident in Atlanta. The Southern Pearl Institute for Inclusive Hospitality is now officially open, Marcus announced proudly. Thanks to partnerships with 50 major restaurant groups, we will train over 10,000 restaurant workers this year about true hospitality and inclusion. Karen stepped up to the microphone next. She looked different now, confident, purposeful, and at peace with her past. My biggest mistake became my life's mission, she said. We turned that viral video into a teaching tool. Students watch it and learn how unconscious bias can affect anyone, and more importantly, how we can overcome it. In the audience, Safia wiped away happy tears as she sat next to their parents, who had flown in for this special moment. Their small family restaurant dream had grown into something far bigger than they had imagined. Back in Atlanta, the Southern Pearl had expanded. The building next door had been converted into a training center where Sarah led daily workshops. The restaurant's walls now featured a special photo gallery called Our Community, showing pictures of regular customers from all backgrounds. Tommy, who had witnessed the original incident, had created a special program called Bartenders Against Bias, which was being adopted by bars nationwide. His training manual started with the simple words, "Every story matters, and every customer has one." Marcus pulled up a recent photo on the big screen. It showed the Southern Pearl's dining room on a busy evening. Construction workers sat next to executives. A woman in a hijab chatted with a man in a business suit. Teenagers in hoodies sat near elderly couples in formal wear. This was their dream come true, a place where everyone belonged. But our work isn't finished, Marcus continued. Today, we're launching a scholarship program. Every year, we will help 50 minority students attend culinary school or hospitality management programs. We want to change not just how restaurants treat people, but who gets to run them. Karen smiled as she announced the scholarship's name. The Second Chance Scholarship, because everyone deserves an opportunity to learn and grow from their mistakes. The crowd stood up and applauded. Among them were some of the first graduates of their training program, now running their own restaurants with the same principles of inclusion and respect. Sophia joined her brother and Karen on stage. The Southern Pearl started as our parents' dream of bringing good food to people. Now it's become a movement about bringing all people together. After the speeches, Marcus found a quiet moment backstage. He pulled out his old notebook, the same one he had been writing in that night. Its pages were now filled with notes about their journey, ideas for the future, and stories of lives changed. "You still have that old notebook," Karen said, walking up beside him. "I'll never forget how I thought it looked suspicious that night." Marcus smiled. "Now it's full of stories about transformation, including yours, Karen." The final page of his notebook had a quote their father always said, "Food feeds the body, but kindness feeds the soul." As they walked back to join the others, Marcus's phone buzzed with exciting news. The Southern Pearl had just been named Restaurant of the Year, not for its food, but for its impact on society. Outside the conference hall, a line of young restaurant workers waited to register for training programs. Each of them carried the same dream: to create spaces where everyone felt welcome. The story that began with prejudice had become a story of hope. The Southern Pearl had shown that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them. And in Atlanta, the restaurant's lights glowed warmly each evening, welcoming everyone who walked through its doors, exactly as they were. 1 year to the day after the incident, the Southern Pearl was hosting a very special anniversary dinner. The restaurant looked different now, having grown from a single elegant dining room into what people called the Pearl Complex, 3 connected buildings that housed the restaurant, training center, and their new community outreach facility. Marcus Johnson stood in his old blue hoodie, which was now framed in a glass case in the lobby next to Karen's original manager badge. Both items had become symbols of how far they had come. Beneath them was a simple plaque that read, "Where change began. Never judge a book by its cover." "Can you believe it's been a year?" Karen asked, adjusting the new pearl pin that all graduates of their training program received. She now served as the executive director of their inclusion training program, having trained over 5,000 restaurant workers personally. The anniversary celebration brought together people from across the country. There was Michael, a former homeless man who now ran their job training program in the kitchen; Lisa, a transgender woman who had become their head of customer relations after experiencing discrimination at other restaurants; and James, a former fine dining critic who had written an article about changing the way restaurants judge their customers. Sophia walked through the packed dining room, stopping to greet familiar faces. "Look who's here," she called out, pointing to an elderly couple entering the restaurant. It was the same couple who had been dining there the night of the incident, who had shaken their heads at Karen's behavior. Now they were regular customers and vocal supporters of the restaurant's mission. Tonight, Marcus announced to the gathered crowd, "We're not just celebrating our transformation, we're celebrating everyone who helped make it happen." He gestured to Sarah, now the national training coordinator, and Tommy, whose Bartenders Against Bias program had spread to every state in America. The menu for the evening told its own story. Each dish represented a different lesson learned over the past year. The appetizer, First Impressions, was served on mismatched plates to remind people that beauty comes in many forms. The main course, Common Ground, featured fusion dishes that brought together different culinary traditions. During dinner, a special news report played on screens around the restaurant. It showed the impact of their work. 50 new minority-owned restaurants opened with their support, 300 scholarships awarded, and 10,000 restaurant workers trained in inclusive hospitality. "But our proudest achievement," Karen said, standing to make a toast, "is that we haven't turned away a single guest for their appearance in the past year. Instead, we've welcomed over 100,000 people exactly as they are." The mayor of Atlanta stood up next. "The Southern Pearl has changed more than just our restaurant industry. It's changing how our whole city thinks about inclusion." As the evening continued, Marcus walked to the small corner booth where everything had started. A small golden plaque now marked the spot, "Where mistakes became miracles." He sat down, pulled out his notebook, now volume 12 of his ongoing journey, and began to write. "Still taking notes?" Sophia asked, sliding into the booth across from him. "Always," Marcus smiled. "But now they're about all the lives we've touched. Did you know our story is being taught in business schools now?" Their parents, watching from their special table, couldn't hide their tears of pride. Their small dream of a family restaurant had grown into a nationwide movement for change. As the night drew to a close, Karen gathered everyone for a group photo. In the frame were people of every race, age, and background, all wearing pearl pins that showed they were part of this growing family. 1 year ago, Marcus said in his final speech of the night, "A moment of prejudice could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together and showed us how to help others come together too." Outside, the Atlanta skyline glowed in the dark. The Southern Pearl's sign shone brightest of all, but now it had company. Dozens of other restaurants in the city had added small pearl symbols to their signs, showing they too had joined the movement for true hospitality. And in the window, a simple sign still hummed, "Welcome all who enter here. Your story matters." Below it, someone had added, "Because 1 year ago, we learned that when you open your doors to everyone, Miracles happen. 1 year to the day after the incident, the Southern Pearl was hosting a very special anniversary dinner. The restaurant looked different now, having grown from a single elegant dining room into what people called the Pearl Complex. 3 connected buildings that housed the restaurant, training center, and their new community outreach facility. Marcus Johnson stood in his old blue hoodie, which was now framed in a glass case in the lobby next to Karen's original manager badge. Both items had become symbols of how far they had come. Beneath them was a simple plaque that read, "Where change began. Never judge a book by its cover." "Can you believe it's been a year?" Karen asked, adjusting the new pearl pin that all graduates of their training program received. She now served as the executive director of their inclusion training program, having trained over 5,000 restaurant workers personally. The anniversary celebration brought together people from across the country. There was Michael, a former homeless man who now ran their job training program in the kitchen. Lisa, a transgender woman who had become their head of customer relations after experiencing discrimination at other restaurants. And James, a former fine dining critic who had written an article about changing the way restaurants judge their customers. Sophia walked through the packed dining room, stopping to greet familiar faces. "Look who's here," she called out, pointing to an elderly couple entering the restaurant. It was the same couple who had been dining there the night of the incident, who had shaken their heads at Karen's behavior. Now they were regular customers and vocal supporters of the restaurant's mission. Tonight, Marcus announced to the gathered crowd, "We're not just celebrating our transformation, we're celebrating everyone who helped make it happen." He gestured to Sarah, now the national training coordinator, and Tommy, whose Bartenders Against Bias program had spread to every state in America. The menu for the evening told its own story. Each dish represented a different lesson learned over the past year. The appetizer, First Impressions, was served on mismatched plates to remind people that beauty comes in many forms. The main course, Common Ground, featured fusion dishes that brought together different culinary traditions. During dinner, a special news report played on screens around the restaurant. It showed the impact of their work. 50 new minority-owned restaurants opened with their support, 300 scholarships awarded, and 10,000 restaurant workers trained in inclusive hospitality. But our proudest achievement, Karen said, standing to make a toast, is that we haven't turned away a single guest for their appearance in the past year. Instead, we've welcomed over 100,000 people exactly as they are. The mayor of Atlanta stood up next. The Southern Pearl has changed more than just our restaurant industry. It's changing how our whole city thinks about inclusion. As the evening continued, Marcus walked to the small corner booth where everything had started. A small golden plaque now marked the spot, where mistakes became miracles. He sat down, pulled out his notebook, now volume 12 of his ongoing journey, and began to write. "Still taking notes?" Sophia asked, sliding into the booth across from him. "Always," Marcus smiled. "But now they're about all the lives we've touched. Did you know our story is being taught in business schools now?" Their parents, watching from their special table, couldn't hide their tears of pride. Their small dream of a family restaurant had grown into a nationwide movement for change. As the night drew to a close, Karen gathered everyone for a group photo. In the frame were people of every race, age, and background, all wearing pearl pins that showed they were part of this growing family. 1 year ago, Marcus said in his final speech of the night, "A moment of prejudice could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together and showed us how to help others come together too." Outside, the Atlanta skyline glowed in the dark. The Southern Pearl's sign shone brightest of all, but now it had company. Dozens of other restaurants in the city had added small pearl symbols to their signs, showing they too had joined the movement for true hospitality. And in the window, a simple sign still hung. "Welcome all who enter here. Your story matters." Below it, someone had added, "Because 1 year ago, we learned that when you open your doors to everyone, miracles happen."